Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a good lunch and are ready to a very intensive discussion that we're going to have now in this panel. So my name is Maria Antonieta Lins. I'm from the University of São Paulo, the Institute of International Relations, and I have the honor to chair this only female panel, which is absolutely lovely, wonderful, and inspiring. So, okay, our topic is EU Latin American countries relations in context. We have different topics to be here discussed. Julieta is going to talk about economics. We have two presentations about health and one about environment. Okay, so with not taking most of your time, because I'm going to say some words afterwards, but I know here. I want to start. Where is the short bio? I can't find it. No, but I have to tell who you are. So I thought there was here, but I have not seen it. It should, yeah. Okay, so yeah, that's the best thing that I can ask one of each to present herself and say who they are. But it's a pity because I know we would have a lot of detail about their lives, professional lives. Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Let me. Wow. Okay, so yeah, I want to present the first Julieta Zelikovic. She's a professor and PhD in international relations from the National University of Rosario, Argentina, director of the study group on international trade negotiations, and assistant researcher at the CONICET, the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research in Argentina, the most prestigious research institute in Argentina. So Julieta, you have the floor.
Thank you. And thank you, Andrea, and all the network for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be in Rio and be engaged in these amazing discussions. I have a PPT I prepared for our session. And let me tell you a little how this presentation comes. When Andrea invites me, she proposed me to discuss how trade and crisis get related and how this is shaping EU-LAC relationships. And she talked about the book, maybe a book project, and I got really engaged with the idea. And the last weeks I've been surfing through documents and statistics, analyzing data to figure out this, how trade and crisis get related and how they have affected trade policies in Latin America and EU, and where is the relationship, the governance of trade in the EU-LAC relationship going since these changes. The outline of my idea is briefly this one. We have systemic shocks and international crises, external factors that are not trade-based, that are all those that Stiglitz figured out this morning, primarily the political changes in governments, the geopolitical competition, and climate change, and they are disturbing trade. Trade flows are changing, but also trade narratives. Trade narratives refer to what we believe trade policy should be, what we believe trade distributive effects are, and these are starting to change. When these things change, trade flows and trade narratives, I expect that trade policy strategies will be reconfigured. And when trade policy strategies are reconfigured, we should expect some revision on the existing trade governance tools and also the building of new mechanisms. And this is what is my presentation about. Part one is a little bit about trade flows. The second one, trade policy strategies. And the third one, I went through some, ¿qué hice acá? Apreté mal los botones, sorry. Okay, sorry, it was my mistake with the buttons. So, part one, EU-LAC under the era of permacrisis. I love the concept. I mean, trade is more than putting goods and services in another territory. I love the idea that trade is the mirror on how society are being relating one to each other, how you trust the other in order to make business. And also trade can mirror the effects of other crises. In a 1 decade perspective, we can see how trade has evolved from the era of globalization with a big increase in trade expansion to an era of globalization. This globalization has been marked through several crises. Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008 set the end of one way of doing business and started the new era. But then we have, in 2012, China becomes the largest trading nation, and this for trade is a very important issue. The end of the commodities boom that is relevant for Latin American economies, Brexit, US-China trade war, pandemics, the war in Ukraine, several events that have affected trade otherwise by modifying the prices of commodities on goods or creating a more uncertain scenario. With more uncertainty, the cost of doing business rises, and governments start to change their perspective from a rent-oriented, a profit-oriented perspective to a risk diversion perspective. And that's what we are going to see. Whereas the world moved through these several crises, EU-LAC trade was pretty stable. I mean, we don't see big changes in the exports and imports of each size, but I want to highlight 3 concerning factors. One, trade has remained really unbalanced. The EU exports to Latin America much more than what Latin America exports to the EU. So we have an unbalanced trade relationship. This trade relationship, although it recovered from pandemic whatsoever, it has been, in relative terms, declining. The bilateral trade participation in total exports has reduced from 10%, what what Latin American exports to the EU in the total of Latin American exports went from 10% to 9%. And China was the big winner in this transformation. But also Latin America became less important in relative terms to Europe, from 3% to 2%. So we have an unbalanced, asymmetric, and declining trade relationship, and also a trade relationship that is mainly based on inter-industrial trade. The colonial terms of exchange have remained. There hasn't been any trade diversification, or maybe there are some sectorial, very limited trade diversification cases, but if you take a picture of the trade relationship in big terms, Latin American countries export mainly primary products. I mean, here it says, we have minerals and fuels, ores, slag, residues and waste from food industries, coffee, tea, and we import technological goods, vehicles, plastics and articles, organic chemicals, optical, photographic, cinematographic, I mean, value-added products. Trade also is unbalanced in this way. And it hasn't changed. In a decade of many changes in world trade, Latin American, EU trade, it remained the same. Let's see what happened with trade policies. And here also we are seeing great differences. On the EU side, this is like a summary of the main policy transformations that you ran through the last 5 years. Mainly they are summarized in the trade policy review of 2021. Europe acquainted all these global changes, this era of permacrisis, and realized that trade couldn't be driven only by profit and market access, but that trend was needed to be in relation with trade, with foreign policy goals, autonomy, the Green Deal. It was a tool for exporting EU values and make multilateralism stronger. So the goals and priorities in Europe, they are easily traceable in trade. I mean, I can go through documents in the Commission and see what the European Union wants with its trade policy: reform the WTO, support the green transition, support digital transition and trade services, strengthen EU regulatory impact, strengthen the EU partnership with neighboring countries, strengthen EU focus on implementation and enforcement of trade agreements, and ensure a level playing field. Many trade reforms, but Latin America doesn't have a unified voice, doesn't have coordination mechanisms in trade. And whereas the EU is easily traceable, in the draft of my paper, I have all the sequences of the document, how this is moving forward, and I don't want to stop here because I want to get to the third part that is the more interesting. It's very asymmetric with what happens in Latin America. The EU changes its trade policy, especially making more geoeconomically oriented and climate change friendly in goals. In this, what were the goals? But in Latin America, this is not what I found. Latin America lacks of unified voice for trade policy. The main hemispheric mechanism, that is CELAC, is not trade specific. And the other one we can look for, that is ALADI, it doesn't have the same tools. It's not the equivalent to the European Union Trade Commission by far. So there is no policy coordination. There is no a clear strategy towards where Latin American countries wants to go with its trade policy. And even in individual countries, trade policy has had very limited policy space, since foreign agreements has restricted many tools, and since fiscal capabilities have been reduced since all those external crises. So external crises reduce policy space. What we found, Latin American tariff average has been reducing. This is not because Latin America decided to open its economy in response to international crisis, but because it had international commitments by many FTAs to continue reducing its external tariff. Although the external tariff are still much higher than the world average. In total, Latin America has 82 FTAs signed with several countries. And the other policy-driven, the other factor that has driven trade policy reform in Latin America has been the trade facilitation agreement of WTO, that is an agreement on custom procedures mainly, and it has had a great impact in how Latin American trade policies has transformed, but we are not seeing the same capability of having a diagnosis of international change in Latin America, of the international changes impact on trade, and redesign trade policies. Trade policies have been reactive towards what's happening outside. Even in CELAC, the last meeting of CELAC, the working program related to trade, it has figured out some agendas where there is no active policy yet in those areas. What are the areas that, as EU cares on geoeconomics and climate change, what do Latin American cares about in trade? Food security, infrastructure, climate cooperation, and digital transformation. So this is what mainly I figure out in how trade narratives and trade policies are getting transformed. But okay, what's about governance? And we have the all governance mechanisms in EU-LAC relationship that are mainly the FTAs that Europe has signed with Latin America. We have the first one in Mexico and Chile in 1997 and the early 2000s, Mexico and Chile, that are very light trade agreements. In the gráfico de barras, in the one of that side, you can see what is the DESTA depth index. DESTA is a project based in Bern that has a very big database on several aspects of trade agreements. One of them is depth, that is measuring how many political trade policy issues are included in the agreements, and the agreement with Mexico is a rather shallow agreement, whereas the next agreements that the EU signed with Latin American countries, especially the Colombian and Peru agreement and Central American agreement, are considered depth agreements. This initial framework doesn't include the new European policy goals. They don't have very deep commitments on sustainable development, and they are not going completely into these new goals on services, digital transformation, and securing supply chains. So they move to a new set of mechanisms, and this is the exciting part of the chapter. I figure out we are seeing a transformation on the EU trade governance because of crisis. The way that the EU has perceived crisis has driven to a change in the trade governance mechanisms in the intra-regional context. And there are three things that are happening at the same time. On the one hand, we are seeing the modernization of the existing FTAs, Chile and Mexico, and the conclusion of pending trade agreements that are being reformed to include these new goals, the EU-Mercosur agreement. But we are seeing, since the last visit of von der Leyen to Latin America, the emergence of new types of cooperation agreements that are not FTAs, that are cooperation trade-related agreements with a focus on supply chain resiliency and strategic sectors. It's something new. It's not an FTA, it's not a regular cooperation agreement, it's cooperation on trade-related issues that mention trade policies but are not FTAs, and also unilateral EU regulation with extraterritorial reach. The EU is changing the way we can trade each other without negotiating. So I want to show you some of the changes. As regards the FTAs, what I did here, I compare all the agreements with the chapters they include to see what are the new topics, where we can find the new topics, how is the EU trade FTAs template being applied in the relationship with Latin America. And what are the new things in these agreements? Investment chapters. The Chile-EU Modernization Agreement and the Mexico-EU Modernized Agreement in principle, because it's not signed, include an investment chapter. The rest of the agreement, it doesn't. As regards services, we can identify mutual recognition of professional qualifications and also a different framing on the delivery postal courier services. They change from courier and postal to delivery. That includes more services. It's more like the TPP. That's the style. Then the difference also in framing e-commerce or digital trade. In the old agreements, e-commerce is part of services chapter. In the new agreements, there is a separate chapter on digital trade that goes beyond the services commitments. Then we have specific chapters on public procurement, state-owned enterprises, and subsidies. These are also included in the Mercosur-EU FTA in principle, but not in the Central America on Peru and Colombia FTAs. And this is something new. Something new is all the cooperation chapters, non-trade issues that are included in the new FTAs. We have, for example, a chapter on cooperation on sustainable food with Chile that also includes a cooperation on animal welfare and antimicrobial resistance as a topic in the food, in the, how is it? The sustainable food chapter in Chile, whereas in Mexico is a separate chapter. They both include a specific chapter on energy and raw materials, where parties commit each other to cooperate and to ensure certain transparency issues. Trade and gender in Chile. Transfer of technology is in Peru and Colombia and not in these new agreements. Anti-corruption and good regulatory practices. These are new topics that are being included in the FTAs that are aligned with the new EU strategy, and we don't see a similar strategy, a coordinated strategy from Latin America. Then the second one, I go very quickly, critical mineral supply chains. Latin America has a lot of critical minerals stuff, and we need 6 times what these minerals are used nowadays. The Goldman Sachs says that for 2050, we are going to need 6 times more this kind of minerals. So this kind of a strategic issue. And there are 3 memorandum of understanding signed with the region, with Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. They said cooperation on joint development projects, transparency, they agree on a rules-based relationship. They promise to build a roadmap, but there are some specific trade policies included there, such as export restrictions. Parties commit each other to not to apply export restrictions in raw material. What happened with Indonesia? That Indonesia apply restrictions on the exports of nickels. And they are all soft law. It's not an FTA, there is no dispute settlement mechanism. We believe in each other, we will commit to this. And lastly, unilateral policies and the long-arm legislation with effect on trade from the EU. And the 3 main pieces of regulations I've been studying is the EU regulation on deforestation and forest degradation that has an effect on trade with Latin America, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and also the corporate sustainability due diligence regulation that are also framing the relationships. So I have 4 preliminary final remarks. Trade relationship is vulnerable to external transformations, although neither the European Union or Latin American are the main actors in this political transformation in global arena. They are still suffering the changes from all the crises, this permacrisis era. What is modifying trade relationship is those crises that the European Union prioritizes. So its focus is not everything, but is especially geoeconomic, supply chain risk, and climate change. Actorness, the EU has greater actorness than Latin America, and this is shown in its capacity in the agenda setting compared to Latin America. And since the new mechanisms, and I didn't say it, the Memorandum of Understanding are bilateral. It's not a CELAC EU Memorandum of Understanding, it's not a Mercosur Memorandum of Understanding, it's bilateral. So through bilateral mechanisms and unilateralisms, the EU is, I think, my hypothesis is driving to a more fragmented and asymmetrical relationship with Latin America, and this has consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julieta. I just want to add that if we take Jose's presentation this morning, if we take Julieta and all the discussion, the background or the that Stiglitz brought, and if we want to ask what if or what is going on with finance, we could say that there's no coordination at all. And I like very much the way Julieta puts it, first looking at the European Union policies, then the EU or the Latin American country policies, and then the relationship. And if we look at Latin America in or concerning financial issues, what we see perfectly, there's no coordination at all between countries. And even like the ambassador said this morning, even if we accept that Brazil and Argentina will be together forever and ever, and doesn't matter which government, I wouldn't say that, because who is helping whom now when Argentina is facing a huge crisis and Brazil is receiving capital flows from one side or the other. And so in the financial arena, we don't see any type of coordination at all. And we don't see any type of effort between and among countries to go further or to organize, to make something together, to, I mean, regionalism in finance just doesn't exist. And this is very complicated in a world economy in which finance is more and more important, and is like having a lot of power in reality to push governments to impact in elections process, etc. So that was my very short word before passing the floor to Maureen Santos. She's the professor of the Institute of International Relations here at PUC and coordinates the social environment platform of the BRICS Policy Center. She's the coordinator of the social environment justice program of the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Brazil. She holds a master's degree in political science from, I don't know what is IFCS, the Institute of Physics. Political science in the Federal University here, and a bachelor degrees in international relations from Universidade Estácio de Sá here in Rio. So Maureen, thank you so much to be here, and I'll pass.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Yeah. No, ela que vai passar. No, but it's okay. Some graphics is not, but first, thank you very much for the invitation. My idea is to focus in the European Union Mercosur agreements, is that the one I study more, specifically about a lot of issues Juliet already present here, and I totally agree with everything she said and bring, and it's amazing these graphics and information. So the first point I'm talking about the chapter of the trade and sustainable development, and also the connections to the impacts in the environmental of the other chapters, because this agreement, they bring to Mercosur, it's like they nominate the agreement as a modern agreement. It's a modern agreement because they also plays a role of environmental protection or climate protection. So there is this chapter, but when you saw the trade in goods, it's exactly what Julieta said. No, it's a completely asymmetric. You are buying, importing products for very big value, very industrialized product. At the same time, you are exporting raw materials to European Union. So in the end of the calculation, what we talk about is natural resources. Now we are talking about land, and we are talking about our, it's agribusiness, mining, all this, the connection have a deep impact in the environmental. That's the chapter of sustainable development and trade didn't protect. So it's they call a chapter without teeth, because they don't have any kind of obligation and legally binding for legislation. At the same time, no arbitrage, como seria em inglês? Arbitrage, ok, francês. Mas se não der, não tem problema. Era só para mostrar. Okay. So no, you will show you about the main products, but it's okay. I can share with you later. So I will start with this point and have other two. This chapter, okay, fine. So just the example of, get it? Okay. And now I have to look for mine. Okay, yes, this one. So what you have when the agreement, the Mercosur European Union agreement in principle, when they proposed, it was like 20 years ago. No, so it's a very old negotiation of agreement. Right now we are in a phase that the people that are following very close looks like they're trying to do like you have the agreement, but you can change, because if you change, you have to reopen the negotiations that take already 20 years. This last version is the version more or less restarted in 2016. And if you reopen, probably be very hard to make all the harmonization and all the process of translation, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea now is to do a kind of amendments and depend of who is the part. Now, in the case of European Union, the main issue is related to countries that believe that the agreement is not environmental friendly enough. So they need to get more strong in a chapter. They need to have this teeth against some kinds of impacts in climate agenda or environment. At the same time, for Mercosur, this kind of decision to push too much for an environmental agenda and create some kind of legally binding amendment, it will be hard for the agreement, because this can be a measure of protectionism, and this is against the free trade. Now, even if the agreement is not only, as the European Union said, not free trade, you have a chapter of agreement of cooperation, you have agreement of political dialogue. So, but I lost a little bit this beginning because the presentation. What I want to show you, two graphics, two images. It's not this one, is the next one, then I come back to this. Okay, this one. Okay, this is the main products that you'll be export. It's a quota, okay? It's not a free tariff, okay? It's inside of an intra quota that you have in the agreement. The European Union is giving more % of a quota. And what you have here, just to connect to the environmental discussion, you have corn. Corn is related to the soybean production, because it's a consortiation of the agro chain. So, and it's already eliminated. So we don't have tariffs right now, okay? But this was a elimination that was temporarily, but the European keep doing, of course, because they need this. So they are not, but as is a temporary, it's not a really agreed. It's if they included that in the agreement, they have the decision that to have a better quota. Sugar and ethanol, it's connected, of course, because you have this, it's the sugar cane, but you have in the different quotas. You have quota for sugar and you have intra quota for ethanol. And you can see how much more quota you increase in the sugarcane exportation. And you know that in Brazil, specifically, you have in other countries of Mercosur for sugarcane, but specifically in Brazil is the production of ethanol. And the country has, of course, interest to sell more. For one hand, European Union right now is in all this dialogue of the green transition to invest in electric car. So it means that probably this intra-quota of that increase 540%, maybe they not even achieve this thing, because you have this interest in electrical car. Okay, so in the beginning you'll be, oh my God, it will be very increasing, but really realistically, I don't think European Union, they offer that because, okay, you can sell, but this doesn't mean that the European Union will buy. And this is beneficiate because when you talk about sugar here, you talk about the raw material to produce sugar. It's not, so the product, ethanol, it's more expensive, than the other one. And what I'm pushing this issue, because this be very invisible in the list of the negotiation, because it shows that the European is increasing something that show that they offer more benefits inside the offers, but at the same time, doesn't mean that the European Union, you buy that. They can buy that. Now they can sell, can receive. And when you look, I don't have a figure about the mining, but as Julieta talked about the critical mining, right now, of course, all the countries is looking for that, and all Latin America has the majority of this critical mining products, and with this green transition, you depend of these products to do batteries, for bikes, for electrical car, for everything you are thinking about to be electric. And at the same time, if all the war in Ukraine is pushing also this running for this kind of critical mining, in the negotiation of European Union Mercosur, it's not even an intra quota, it's already a cut tariff. So related to copper, silver, and minério de ferro, oh my God. Okay, iron mining. They have, as soon as the agreement be signed and ratified, you have already started the liberalization, and until they go until 0 in 7 years. So we are talking about mining that have already a lot of complexity in the Mercosur region. Iron mining, it's about companies like Vale and all these big environmental impacts and tragedies that already happens in the territory. And none of this, it's even including in this chapter of the sustainable development and trade. No, the chapter is really, it's like they have topics and declarations. They push for some the labor ILO, the International Labor Organization's measures, but they don't even mention the Convention 169 of ILO that that Brazil also and the other countries of Mercosur is signatory, that said that for indigenous people and traditional communities, if you start a project or you start a process of infrastructure or anything in this land, you have to do a previous informed consultation. And this, in the agreement, they mention, not including inside of ILO measures, but they mention that indigenous, they didn't even say indigenous people, have traditional communities or local communities, something like that, have to be able to be part of the process or the improvement or the project. But this doesn't have anything related to the convention. The convention said they need to be informed previously. They need to be consulting, because there is about their land. So what you see in all these issues, that you have non-benefit, even IPEA, that's the Brazilian study, federal institution of studies, economic studies, they made the first report related to European Union Mercosur agreement to evaluate the agreement and what is interesting for the country, what is not. And the conclusion of IPEA in this bulletin said that the agreement will not be very interesting. They use a word like interesting to Mercosur because the win will not be too big. You lost much more, even for agribusiness. It shows that at least three big things. One that already Julieta said, it's a representation, or it's a process that keep going a situation of colonization. Now you keep pushing the same model that Latin America, in the case of Mercosur countries, keep being the countries that offer only raw materials and cheap products to keep the production and the measures and politics for European Union. At the same time, we keep exporting and not developing our industry. And this it's not only me that say, it's a document, European Union, that was leaked some months ago. And Brazil is one of the mentioned countries in this document that was leaked, that say the three main worries about Brazil. One is about Brazilian Lula, the new government, didn't sign this agreement. The second one is about the reindustrialization policy that Lula is bringing to the country. So how a bloc that said so many things about supporting the fighting against poverty, developing the other countries, respect democracy, and all this is worry about the industrialization of a country that have these issues of impact economicals like now. And the third one, I really don't remember. The third one is what the European Union offer to keep the situation a little better. And one of the offerings is about the transfer of technology in digital industry. That's one of the interests of Brazil. So to conclude, so it's the first issues. Now, if you really want to create a fair agreement between the two blocks, they have to pass this kind of asymmetrical relations and get a more equitable agreement between the two blocks. At the same time, the agreement was made without a really big study of social environment impacts. There is only this one from NIPEA, and there is other one from one agency in European Union, but they was made before the agreement was completely closed. So, and also they didn't mention a lot of these connections that we're expressing as an example here. At the same time, you have the unilateral measures that Julieta mentioned also in the end, these 3 unilateral measures that the European Union is signing that have a huge impact in the trade relations. Why? Not only the trade relations. First, because this measure it's outside of this agreement. So even if they said that, no, maybe you can flexibilize for Mercosur or for this new agreement that we're doing, they make this discussion now when Lula and the Mercosur present the letter. I don't know if you saw the Mercosur present a counter letter after the European Union prepare a letter on environment. So the answer of the European Union say, if you are worried about these unilateral issues, maybe you can check how can we flexibilize some of them. But at the same time, even if I think some of them is very interesting in the matter of environmental, specifically because I'm environmentalist, I really want a carbon to be taxing the frontier and a lot of this. But we can't in this world do measures unilaterally because we're destroying the multilateral system. And this have a huge impact for other kind of agreements that the UN system has. So we're talking about the Climate Change Convention and Paris Agreement. We talk about even the WTO. You're talking about other schemes that was based on a multilateral system that's more equitable and even have, of course, have a dispute of power, but you have much more possibilities to countries that's very, very small and probably doesn't have any voice in other places, have voice because they are together. So when you talk about climate change, you hear like Nauru talking or Tuvalu, and you give a chance for them to say things that is very important and be taken in serious. And all this because you have a block of islands that's very strong in the negotiations. Or also Bolivia that have in the preamble of the agreement, Paris Agreement, a mention of Pachamama. I think you'll never see in any of the preambles of UN negotiations. Why you have that? Because this country have power and voice inside. So this, if you destroy the multilateralism and looks like European Union, and I'm afraid, really afraid of that, because supposedly they always support the multilaterally, but with this kind of measures, time by time, it's like you are eating, you know, a little bit of this process. And this is very worrying because this is not only related to this agreement, but it's about the system, the global system as well. So I'll finish with that, and thank you.
Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Sara Gaspar. She has a bachelor's degree in law from Faculdade de Direito do Sul de Minas and a master's degree in public health from the Institute of Social Medicine at the Rio de Janeiro State University. She works as a consultant to Hepatitis C project, treatment action, and is a board member of Universities Allied from Essential Medicines in Brazil, UAM. She has more than 10 years of experience in health advocacy, focused on access to health technologies, global health, and intellectual property. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Sara, I believe I met you, a couple of you before we started. And thank you for the invitation. It's always very interesting to hear from outside the access to medicine movement. I think we close ourselves to other perspectives, and it's very interesting to hear about trade policy and environmental policy, and how that connects to what it seems to be, something in common from all the presentations we have already, is the maintenance of the International Division of Labor. Latin America keeps exporting basic products and buying industrialized products with added value, and how hard it is to change this narrative and this policy for Latin America, but specifically for Brazil too. So you can go to the next one. I'll just, Maria already presented my credentials. Thank you, Maria. But I like to start any presentation give first saying that all opinions I present are my own. I'm not here presenting in the name of UAM and Treatment Action Group, even though I work with them. But also I like to start every presentation with a statement of where my opinions come from. And I like this photograph. It's a UAM protest in Basel. I think it was in 2016. We occupied a bridge, and you can see Gilead's, no, it's Novartis building in the back. And I start with that because I like to be upfront that I don't believe that the right to health should be, mediated by the economic capabilities. So I believe everyone has the right to health, and their ability to purchase or to afford treatment and diagnostic shouldn't be a modulator to their right to health. So just to say where I come from, and that, that's where I will try to present a couple of things and have a discussion with you. You can go to the next one. So I would like to also start with like a roundup of the architecture of the intellectual property system that we have, specifically connecting to health. I don't know how familiarized you are with that. We can have a whole discussion about the specifics, but just to contextualize everyone, the TRIPS agreement, trade-related intellectual property rights agreement, is the landmark, I think we can put like that, of the connection or the transportation of intellectual property from the World Intellectual Property Organization to the World Trade Organization. It is part of the World Trade Organization entering agreement. You cannot be part of the World Trade Organization without signing the TRIPS agreement, which is saying a lot. And the TRIPS agreement is a benchmark of intellectual property for all the countries that want to be part of the World Trade Organization. And by the time it was being discussed and it was being negotiated, there was a lot of fear and protest, and we'll see the next slide, but not yet, around how that would impact access to medicines. And you can see the date in 1994, a lifetime ago, but in 1994, we're living the height of the HIV crisis, and the first treatments were being developed. First treatments were extremely expensive, and activists were, they were very worried about how they could afford that, and also how people in other countries that didn't have the same resources would be able to afford that, because the TRIPS agreement created a benchmark for all the countries. Like Brazil didn't accept pharmaceutical patents before the TRIPS agreement, and a lot of other countries had their own specifications and their own, the considerations around what they considered patentable and whatnot. So by creating a common benchmark, it would be very damaging to a lot of public health programs. And then Brazil signed it. You are international relations expert, so you don't need to. I don't need to remind you that the movement that was going in Brazil with like trade liberalization and Brazil, trying to join this movement, and Brazil approved the intellectual property law in 1996, which was, a shift. It internalized the TRIPS agreement, and Brazil, when approving this law, let go of some flexibilities that were in the TRIPS agreement regarding a delay to approve patents or to start approving patents for fields that Brazil didn't recognize before, which is, it's a sign of how much Brazil was intending to send a message, I think, to the world. In 2001, we had the Doha Declaration. There was a declaration around intellectual property rights and health that was, very connected to the HIV movement and access to medicines movement, because it was clear that by creating or by enforcing intellectual property rights, we were making medicines less affordable, and we were stopping people in countries to access, especially HIV medicines, but not only. We have, and this is more modern for those of you born after the 2000s, the Brazilian health emergency law. This translation is my own. I don't know if in English we could say that, but it was approved in 2021 as a response against the COVID pandemic that showcased how intellectual property can be a hurdle in accessing vaccines, treatments in pandemics. And the access to medicines movement were very active regarding this law in Brazil, but sadly, a lot of it, especially the parts where it would make companies more liable to share trade secrets and to make medicines and vaccines and other health technologies viable in case of a compulsory license. They were vetoed, and the vetoes remained. So, it was a win, but not a great win. And we have the EU-Mercosur agreement. I will not go in depth on that because, I think the text is not final, but I think I'll try to discuss the context. And the presenters already did much better than I can do, how this affect the trade policy and the trade fluxes between Brazil, Latin America as a whole, and the EU. You can go to the next. So I like to pay homage to the HIV movement, to the AIDS movement, as it's more common known in Brazil, because a lot of the access to medicine movement is connected to the HIV movement, and I feel that we could only arrive where we are in the HIV pandemic, that it was before a death sentence. Now I like these two works because, especially the second one, it brings this idea of something that you live with. It's something that it's part of your routine, and it's not a death sentence. And I think we could only get there because a lot of people fought, a lot of people died, and a lot of people were not silent when they saw injustice, and they wanted to live in a world where this would be the reality. And it's still not over. I feel like we will discuss a lot of, I'll bring some case studies for us to discuss some aspects of this. But I like to remember this movement that is still very much alive and is still fighting for the right to health for everyone. Next one. So considering the system that the TRIPS agreement was the benchmark, and it brought intellectual property from the Intellectual Property Organization to the World Trade Organization. A lot of activists say that the system doesn't work, and I agree, but I also disagree. I think the system works very well. I think the system works for what it was intended, that is making profit. It's fantastic. It's one of the most profitable industries. The profit margins are sky high, and especially in the pandemic years, there's the joke that is not a joke. This is actually a reality of the pandemic billionaires, because the pharmaceutical companies made so much money that a lot of people that were only millionaires became billionaires from one day to another. It's insane, the amount of money, and it's a system that works very well. It's a system designed to make money. And what are the consequences of a system that is designed to make money? To protect intellectual property, to make it very hard for countries to prioritize their public health systems or their public health needs. What are the consequences? I'm sorry I couldn't find this article in English. I don't think they published in English yet, but it's an article from Médecins du Monde, which is an organization that works with humanitarian relief, but also with access to medicines. And this is an article, I think, from this week. It's very new. It's regarding HCV treatment. Sofosbuvir, you may have heard of that. Sofosbuvir is a very innovative treatment. It's a treatment for hepatitis C that changed the game for hepatitis C. Hepatitis C used to be a very hard to treat condition. You needed to go through a treatment of monthly injections from 6 months to a year, and the cure rate was around 30%. It was a horrible treatment. People usually didn't finish it because you had a lot of side effects and a lot of, it was, you only had a 30% chance of getting cured. So Sofosbuvir with added daclatazil, I'll spare you from the horrible names, changed the game of the treatment. Now you can get treated for HCV in 3 months, 1 pill a day for 3 months, minimal side effects, fantastic. But when it was launched, it cost $90,000 a treatment. It was $1,000 pill. It was exactly $1,000 per pill. And it was appalling. It was extremely expensive. And I think it serves as a great example of how unsustainable for countries and for people the system is. It's great at making money for a very small group of people, but it's horrible to everyone else. And this article highlights how introducing higher protection for intellectual property, one, doesn't mean that we'll have more innovation. And it doesn't mean that innovation that comes out of it is great innovation. So Sofosbuvir is it's a molecule that a lot of pharmacists and chemical scientists affirm that it shouldn't be patented. It's not, it doesn't prove enough innovative action and all the other criteria that you need to patent something under the TRIPS agreement. We're not talking about anything radical, we're talking about TRIPS agreement. And the Intellectual Property Office of France did deny the first patent for Sofosbuvir, but Gilead, which is the patent holder, appealed, and a lot of access to medicines activists compile case studies, brought in pharmacists and chemists, and did a very good job at argumenting that the patent shouldn't be upheld, and second, it shouldn't be upheld also because it would make treatment impossible in France for a great number of people. And sadly, this week the final decision was reached, and the patent of Sofosbuvir was maintained, which means that in France, and we're talking about the developed country, and the article highlights that a lot of patients cannot access the treatment for HCV. They cannot, people in prisons, people they're under a certain level of liver fibrosis, they're denied because the treatment is too expensive. And in July, a study showed the same thing is the case in Canada, where people need to be when you have HCV, you start developing liver fibrosis, which is a side effect and it's horrible and can lead to liver failure and many other horrible symptoms. And in Canada, which is also a developed country and high income country, and by all standards, people are being denied access to a life-saving treatment because the treatment is too expensive. But the treatment is not expensive. The treatment can be made for under $75. It is sold by generic companies for $75, around $75. So what justifies something that can be made with a profit, because generic companies are companies, they do have a profit for $75, and how do you justify selling that for $82,000, $90,000? It's a great system for making money. It's a horrible system for everyone else. You can go to the next. So here I wanted to highlight another symptom of the system that is, and it's not only me talking, I think Professor Stiglitz also highlights that, and Professor Mazzucato and Cassiolato, and we can find a long list of highly qualified people, much more qualified than I am, that argue that it's a system that privatizes the profits, but shares the losses. Because, you are academics, that science is not made by one person in one lab. Doesn't matter how smart and how applied you are, science is not made like that. Science is an acquired body of knowledge made by 1,000 hands and many more grants and many more institutions, and is a system that privatizes when the science is good and it's effective, but shares the losses. And here, I also like to bring an example of a diagnostic that is not, we always talk about medicines and about treatment, but diagnostics are a big part of healthcare and very important for achieving healthcare goals. And this is it's a very good visual representation from MSF Access of the amount of money that went into developing Cephaid's technology for RNA tests. Cephaid has a great machine that is, it can perform from 4 to 32 tests at the same time, and it's very easy to use. It's smaller than a small fridge, and you have a cartridge, and you take sample, you put in a cartridge. It's very minimal work. It can be done by minimally trained people. You don't need like a very high-tech lab to do that. And you can have results in under 2 hours for tuberculosis, for HCV, for HIV, and many more diseases, but the cartridges are extremely expensive. It's a proprietary technology, and it's of propriety of Cephaid. And MSF Access has this great study that they showcase how low this technology could be sold for, and also how important it would be for MSF and for health systems to have access to this technology. For example, to put it in a boat and go through the rivers of Amazon and diagnose people that don't have access to a high-tech lab to know if they have tuberculosis, if they have HIV, or if they have been in contact with any other infectious diseases. And I like to bring this because it showcases also how much money goes into developing. Yes, is always an argument that pharmaceutical companies and diagnostic companies make. It is very expensive to develop new technologies and to not only develop but put them in the market. It is expensive, but it is expensive to the public. You can see a lot of grants from NIH. You can see a lot of grants from tax credits, which is public money. You can see government grants and how much money we're already paid for this technology to be developed. And in the end, we're paying 2 times. We're paying to develop, and then this technology is privatized, and then we're paying very, very high price again to access it. So it's a system that is exceptional at making money, but it's not good at sharing the benefits from science and from all the hard work of the people that dedicated decades developing these technologies. You can go to the next. And the third symptom that I wanted to highlight is that a system that is good at making money, it will decide on its priorities based on that. So we have cases of a lot of neglected diseases that affect us on a daily basis here in Brazil. Dengue, Chagas, and many other neglected diseases that are not a priority because they affect people that are not a priority. And we like to say that it's not a neglected disease, it's neglected populations, because the people that are affected by them are not a priority. They're not the main source of profit. So their health needs will not be met. But I wanted to bring another case that has been gaining prominence, and it's something that is has received a lot of attention from developed countries or high-income countries too, because it affects them also. That is antimicrobial resistance. Antimicrobial resistance is the side effect of us having used a lot of antibiotics in animal health, in human health, but also of us prioritizing profit over health needs, because the pipeline for new antibiotics especially is frozen in the 80s, and the 80s was a long time ago. It was frozen in the 80s because antibiotics are not profitable. Antibiotics, when you develop new antibiotic, you should use it very sparingly in very specific situations to make sure that you have it for a long time, that it will not develop, the bacteria will not develop resistance. So it's not profitable. And a lot of the big pharmaceutical companies dropped their R&D pipeline for new antibiotics in the 80s. And the antibiotics that we have now are either decades old or they're little variations of antibiotics that are decades old. So it's a growing problem, and it's a problem exacerbated by deforestation and intensive agricultural production. But it's also a symptom of a system that prioritizes profit over health needs. And it's interesting how much more attention, I think, and also financing there is for AMR, especially from high-income countries compared to neglected diseases, because it does affect them. There's strains of gonorrhea that are untreatable. There are strains of tuberculosis that are untreatable. And I think it highlights something that we learned the hard way with COVID, that is none of us are safe when one of us are not safe. So if we don't, think of a better way to organize a system, things like this will keep happening. AMR will keep, or similar cases will keep happening, because we are in this together, to be very cheesy. So you can go to the next one. I'll touch on this, but I think Elena will probably talk about this in depth. The COVID pandemic is an example of, I feel, a symptom of the multilateral system. I'm trying to connect this to the main theme of this conference, of how the system was unable to give a proper response to the crisis, because we're talking about a pandemic that we all experienced, and we all lost someone to this pandemic, and it was global, and it was scary, and it was it was something unlike anything that we lived before, and still the multilateral system could not deliver a good response to it. You can go to the next one. We see some countries trying to affirm the prominence of health needs over profits or over intellectual property, but that's very fragmented. A lot of resistance from high income countries, surprising support from other countries. The United States changed their position on this, specifically for the COVID vaccine. They are one of the big enforcers of intellectual property in health, and they changed their position, which was a surprise, but also not enough. And the whole response from the multilateral system was inadequate. A lot of people were left to not receive the first dose of the vaccine, while other countries and other parts of the world were receiving like the 5th dose of the vaccine. There's a lot of intersection with racism and economic inequality and gender inequality in the COVID pandemic response. So I think it raises a question of what are the interests being defended in the multilateral system, and how can a multilateral system or part of it that defends interests that are clearly not the interest of the majority, or not the majority, it's not a good expression, but the interest of their populations, of the interest of their public health systems. They're defending the interests of a very select group of people that profit from this system. How that cannot undermine the multilateral system, because something that doesn't reflect your needs or the needs of the people that you love, of the people of the collective, it will have a hard time reaffirming its prominence. So I think this is the last one. You can go to the next. Yeah. So just to finish, because I think I'm close to my time. I would like to mention, I think it was mentioned a lot of times, that there's this disconnect between the discourse and the practice, especially in the EU, where in the FTAs and the other agreements that they always mention that intellectual property should not be a barrier to health and to this and that, but in the nitty-gritty fine lines, there is a push for increasing for TRIPS plus clauses. I think Bianca Carvalho, which is a alumni of this university, she has a great article that highlights that. And I think it's important to have that in mind, not only for health, but also for the other areas, how there's this disconnect. And I like, Maureen, when you mentioned how absurd it is that a bloc like the EU, that it's very pro development and all that in discourse, is worried about Brazil's push to reindustrialize. So I think the final message is that the promises from the liberalization of the 90s, from increasing openness to the trade community, to the global community, they're all unmet. We didn't develop more technology. We don't have more access. And how do we want to go from here? Because it is a system that was built. It's not a nature law. It's not like gravity or the earth being round, which is disputable by some people. It's a system that was built. So it's something that can be changed, even though it seems like unsurmountable. It's not. And I think it's always important to remember that before the TRIPS agreement, Brazil did not recognize patents on pharmaceutical technologies. So there was a time before Brazil did that. It's not something that was born with the country. So yeah, I'll stop there because I think I reached my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. Now, Milena Coelho is a junior associate at Global Health Strategies, Rio office. She has been part of Global Strategies office since the beginning of 2022, acting mainly on projects related to malaria and COVID. As a junior associate, Milena provides programmatic support for the development of political and context report, as well as project management activities. She holds a bachelor degree in international relations from PUC-Rio and is currently finalizing her master's in international already.
This is a bit.
I
I shared another bio. After.
Okay. In international policy analysis and management at PUC-Rio. Her main areas of interest are global health equity access and equity access to essential medical tools and environmental issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for all the contributions. My presentation will be really similar. I mean, not similar, but complementary to Sarah's. And I think it was great because you contextualized a lot of intellectual property, which is also the thing that I'm bringing. But I'll be focusing more on the COVID pandemic as almost like a case study. So, and also differently from most of the presentations, I won't be speaking directly about the relations between the EU and Latin America, but more broadly about the relations between Global North and Global South. But hopefully this will add to the discussion since there's, I feel like the EU and Latin America relations reflect a little bit on Global North and South. So my focus will be on I will have a problem to look at the at the presentation, but yeah, I'll be talking about access to medicines, diagnostics, and vaccines during the COVID pandemic, and the lessons learned for future health emergencies. Here, my main argument is that the concentration of the global production of those health products was one of the major the concentration of the global production of those health products was one of the major structural barriers to the equitable and broad access to vaccines, diagnostics, as you also mentioned, and medicines during the pandemic. So I will argue that the diversification of the production of those health technologies, which includes the local production in the Global South, becomes crucial for an equitable and more efficient response to future pandemics. So to start, you can pass. To start, I will share some data from this year, 2023, which is 3 years after the beginning of the pandemic, just to show that the situation on access, even 3 years after the beginning of the pandemic, is still critical. So regarding diagnostics, we see that only 20% of all COVID tests administered worldwide have been used in low and lower middle income countries, despite these countries representing more than 50% of the global population. And regarding medicines, high and upper middle income countries account for more than 80% of all COVID drug purchases, while lower and middle income countries account for just 9%, and low income countries just for 0%. Regarding vaccines, while the population of Europe is 70% vaccinated and for COVID, and the population of the United States and Canada is 81% vaccinated, only 37% of the population of the African continent has at least one dose of vaccine. You can pass. So I also brought some interesting data, is that 70% of all people with a complete vaccination schedule for COVID are inhabitants of high-income countries, while only 2% are from low-income countries. There is also a really interesting study published in Nature that shows that it is estimated that a full sharing of COVID vaccines would prevent almost 300 million infections and would prevent also more than 1 million deaths from COVID worldwide. So you can go. While trying to understand the reason for this major inequality that took so many lives, it is clear that the concentration of the pharmaceutical market is one of those reasons. So the COVID pandemic, as you said, highlighted this structure that it's been living for so long. We have the HIV case, Ebola, influenza, HPV, and more. And COVID is only a fragmentation of what is happening for many decades. So you can go with some data about this concentration is that for vaccines, for example, WHO warned that the supply for vaccines in the world is still highly dependent on less than 10 global scales manufactured. Among the vaccine producing countries recognized by WHO, 65% are high income countries, while 22% are upper middle income countries and 11% low income countries. It is also worth mentioning that 72% of all the sales in the pharmaceutical market, which includes diagnostics, vaccines, medicines, everything, 72% of these markets were concentrated in the United States and in Europe. So now I'm gonna talk a little bit about the profitability of this industry, which was also mentioned by you. Even though this industry is highly concentrated in only a few countries, this industry's profitability is one of the highest in the whole world. The COVID pandemic, of course, even increased the revenue and the profit potential of this industry. For example, in 2022, Pfizer had its highest revenues in history. You can pass, thank you. So also, similar to what you brought here, but specifically about COVID, private profits are actually based on public investment. In the case of COVID, the largest source of research and development for the vaccines was public, and actually in last place was the private investments, because there's also public and private partnerships and philanthropy, everything. So besides the direct investment that the government made to pharmaceutical companies, the public sector also invests in indirectly through research institutions. The mRNA vaccine technology, for example, that is broadly being used now for COVID, has been studied by scientists of these institutions for decades. Also, even profiting so much, countries had to guarantee indemnity for all liabilities that could arise for the use of their vaccines when signing the procurement contracts with the companies. So this is financially impossible for many low-income countries, which is even one more barrier. You can go. So now I'm going to talk about intellectual property, which was already greatly explained by Sarah. I will just say a little words about that, just to contextualize. The IP aims to get inventors to publicly disclose their invention in exchange for limited monopoly rights. And ideally, this would be beneficial for both sides, both the public and also the patent holder, who through the patent wouldn't have any competition. So they can level up their prices. And this is very unlikely that developing countries could benefit from this dynamics. So a few of the major problems that comes from IP. One of these is, which was also mentioned, is the lack of investment in neglected disease, since the countries that actually has this disease has a really low purchasing power. So companies are not interested, will not have profits selling them. Also, regardless or not, if the IP system incentivizes research and development, the monopoly means that higher prices will be charged for inventions, since there won't be any competition, which is a known form of price reduction. And this, of course, harms access for poorer countries. And lastly, which I'm actually focusing on, is that IP protection exempts the pharmaceutical companies from competition, which allow them to monopolize markets, generate above normal profits, and take over the control of the global health agenda. Also, you've already explained the TRIPS agreement, so this will be easy for me. But we know that the TRIPS agreement has a few flexibilities and safeguards to provide license to produce generics and more. But there is a strong commercial and political pressure on countries that show their interest to use this mechanism. And furthermore, it is a long and bureaucratic process to use these mechanisms, which can be really costly, and also one more barrier for this to be used by developing countries. So during the COVID pandemic, it was not different. Intellectual property granted a small number of companies the monopoly on supply, allocation, and pricing of treatments, diagnostics, vaccines, which limited the access for poorer countries and also limited local production. So now you can pass. The diversification of health technologies production, especially by enabling local production, is key for developing countries to have access to those health technologies, since it is much more affordable and feasible for those developing countries to produce technologies that were already invented. So it is crucial that developed countries and its companies suspend their IP rights and share technologies, know-how, and trade secrets. So you can pass. Thank you. Because of this critical scenario, during the pandemic, there was many cooperation initiatives that emerged with the potential to diversify this market. The first one that I'm gonna talk about is the request for suspendment of certain intellectual properties rights for prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID, which was the TRIPS waiver, also known. In October 2020, South Africa and India proposed to the World Trade Organization a suspension of certain provisions of the TRIPS agreements to deal with the COVID pandemic. The proposal aimed to ensure that IP would not create any barriers to access and to scaling up research, development, and manufacture of those essential products. And then some interesting insights about this first topic, you can go, is that of the 21 members that opposed to the proposal, 80% of the countries were from the European Union or from the European Union delegation. The WTO members who strongly opposed to the proposal were precisely those who are home to the headquarters or large facilities of major vaccine manufacturers such as AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna. 86% of pharmaceutical industry actors who issued or endorsed statements on the topic opposed to the proposal. And on the other hand, the members who most showed their support for the proposal were those with large domestic generic manufacturing capacities, and who had previously considered or engaged in compulsory licensing for developing pharmaceutical products. Next, thank you. Based on those positions, the decision, which was made almost 2 years after the proposal was made, only authorized the use of patents without the consent of the right holder for production of COVID vaccines, excluding all other health products. Even so, the decision is still not able to guarantee the decentralization of vaccine production, considering that this production also requires the sharing of technology, know-how, and commercial secrets, since vaccines are a biological drug. So the next case that I will talk about is the South Africa Technology Transfer Center. In June 2021, the Technology Transfer Center for mRNA vaccine was funded in South Africa, but it's also worth mentioning that in this WHO initiative, there is also a hub in Brazil and in Argentina and other places around the world. This was created with the aim of enabling low and middle income countries to produce this vaccine for COVID. Despite initially focusing on the development of vaccines against COVID, the initiative was also designed considering that the mRNA vaccines technology can also reach other diseases in the future. So initially, the initiative aimed to sign a technology transfer agreement with a commercial manufacturer such as Moderna, which is one of the largest company producing the mRNA vaccine. This would greatly speed up the development of the vaccine at the hub, given that they would use already tested and approved technology. This would enable the hub to quickly begin transferring technology to eligible producers across the continent, the named spokes. However, Moderna refused to share its technology, forcing the hub to develop its own vaccine based on the public available information about Moderna's vaccine. Therefore, the hub is still going through all the testing phases. And this means not only a longer process for the development of a vaccine, which in a scenario of an emergency is not great. And this also brings legal risks of potential patent disputes with the entities that acquires this technology with public information from Moderna. So the last initiative that I'll talk about is the Technology Access Pool, named CTAP, which was designed with the aim of providing a platform for developers of medicine and other technologies related to COVID to voluntarily share their intellectual property knowledge and data with other manufacturers to promote equitable global access to those health technologies during the pandemic. The initiative, however, did not achieve its expected results. As of October 2022, which is 2.5 years after the proposal, no pharmaceutical company shared its technology through the mechanism. The lack of contributions from the pharmaceutical industry, combined with other factors, prevented its success. It is also worth mentioning that none of the 40 countries that supported and sponsored CTAP hosted large pharmaceutical companies, with the exception of Belgium. Next, please. So moving into the lessons learned for future pandemics. Of course, this is a really deep discussion. I'm just bringing some reflections for us to maybe discuss. But one of them is, as Sarah also mentioned, and I mentioned previously, since the government invested vastly in vaccines, diagnostics, and medicines, it is important that they impose conditionalities for the pharmaceutical companies in terms of affordable prices and sharing of intellectual property and know-how, especially during those emergencies. Another reflection is to consider other ways of incentivizing innovation, research, and development that are different from the IP regime. As Sarah said, IP regime is great for who is profiting from it, but not great for the public. Open science and open innovation regimes are an example, which are based on free sharing of information and can be successful. Some successful cases was the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System, the Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, and also the Structural Genomics Consortium. Lastly, in view of the current discussion on the adoption of the International Treaty on Prevention, Preparedness, and Response to Pandemics within the scope of the WHO, it will be key to consider a human rights approach to guarantee equitable access to health technologies by including abiding legislation on research, development, and innovation in health to deal with the obstacles that intellectual property imposes on access. Unfortunately, the most recent discussions of this treaty has been more about health surveillance systems than about access and fair distribution of resources. But there is still more discussion to upcoming, so let's hope. And also it is great to mention that for this treaty to be actually implemented by member states, it is important to strengthen WHO's normative power in the global health governance. Some last insights is that the current framework based on IP rights is dominated by the rights of the large manufacturers and its host countries in opposition to the public rights. which are seen as exceptions and are framed almost as an infringement to the property. One last, and now just to end in a more positive way, if based on a human rights approach, there is hope that the WHO treaty will be a step forward towards an equitable response to the next global health crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. I have, first of all, to apologize to the audience because I didn't control time. So it makes that we are still on time, but we don't have lots of time for Q&A. But because I didn't control the first, so I said, okay, let's go, let's go. Okay, so collecting. Nicola, Carol. Nicole. Ah, yeah.
Okay, so first, I'm not an expert on health access, so maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Actually, I don't know. But I have a few questions based on your presentation, because I think from underlying arguments and things most of us can agree upon. I mean, clearly, right? And there is an underlying critiques on how the capitalistic economic system works, because we can see these market dynamics not only in the health industry, but in every kind of industry. And of course, the health one is particular because you have a direct impact on people, right? So my question is, because I kind of saw a sort of contradiction in your presentation, Sarah, or what appeared for me a contradiction, because you were saying that there are some, let's say, sector of health where there is an underinvestment, right? Like pro-resistant bacteria, I don't remember, whatever. On the other side, so my question is, how will you suggest to attract private investments towards sector which are they're neglected by the private sector without, they say, the incentive of profit? Because here we are talking about capitalism. So of course, companies are driven by profits. And the second question I have is, for me, it was not very clear, the graph that you show about the public investment for Gene X technology, if there is not a reference on how much funds were invested by the private sector. Because I was very impressed by the quantity of public money that were put in there. But as we know, the pharmaceutical sector is probably one of the most intense capital industry in our economy. So it would be very interesting to actually have a comparison. Thank you.
Tuka, I would like to raise a question from Brussels.
Okay. So get the word to Christian. It's okay. Hi, Christian.
Hi, Tuka.
Happy to hear your voice. But
yeah,
but I'll be controlling now.
okay. Okay, no.
No, he can go.
Okay, may I speak?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to make a comment and a question to Julieta. I was very interested by her presentation, but I would like to suggest how to explain the inability of the CELAC to speak with one voice, because this is obviously in the interests of the whole region. And for many, many years, not only this was impossible, but CELAC is almost destroyed. So there is a very asymmetric relation, but this is not the fault of the Union. This is the fault of Latin America and the Caribbean. This has to be not only said clearly, explicitly, but you should question what are the roots of this inability for more than 2 centuries in a region which has much more element of identity than the European nation. European nation were in fight for thousands of years, and with many, many divisions in religion, in culture, in history. This is not the same degree in Latin America, so there is a very big responsibility, and the citizens have to make this clear to their leaders. First comment. And the second one is that when you analyze, and it was very interesting, the relation of trade with the Union, it should be interesting to have a comparative, for example, with the trade between China and the CELAC. This could indicate who is the more colonial in its relations. So thanks, Tuka.
Okay, so it's a very brief question. It's to Sarah. I would like to add another reference in your chronology of documents that is the final report of independent expert groups gathered by the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on universal access to medicines and intellectual property. This was released in 2016. So this was very important to raise some ideas on how to counteract all that you said, the whole history since HIV and then Ebola in 2014. So there is one recommendation that they call the linkage. And we here in Brazil, we were pretty much aware of it because we were the only country that had 2 representatives inside this group. What was very proud of that was Celso Amorim and Jorge Bermudez. Yes, that's a colleague and partner of us too. And then I never heard about this anymore since then. And I follow Bermudez, I follow Fiocruz, I follow the Access to Medicines group in Fiocruz. And I feel like this idea that sounds pretty good. You can explain better. It's the linkage. So the cost of innovation, the cost of developing a new drug, and the profit. Because of course, as Nicola said, companies are there to profit, and there's nothing wrong or illegitimate in this goal. But how is this, like how the follow-up of this idea, if you can share with us? Thank you.
So I have a question that I think can go to everyone, in the sense that I'm trying to put back, our discussion into the main theme that is, and I think you related to that so well, that we can see there is, at the multilateral level, there is a weakening and a lack of responses, certainly COVID, but also climate change. And at the same time, we have been asking all the time, so to what extent, both regionally in Latin America and the EU, but also interregionally in the EU-Latin American relations, can a bridge or can some proposals or strength to the multilateral level appear? And what if we listen to what everything you said, I take just 2 points. Now, one, of course, we have the governments, but then we have civil societies and we have companies. And I think both the climate change and actually in the health area, and I think this is shown by also the data on trade, it seems that maybe it's not only about EU, Latin America, we are talking also about how these positions are influenced by companies. So I think you're right, Nicole, we are all capitalists and also China. So we are not in the Cold War like before, and Stiglitz said that very well also this morning. But even he was saying this, that actually the health crisis and the climate crisis are examples of a complete lack of capacity of coordination of positions. So the real question is, it seems that a lot of government, removing of course the ones that we know, that extreme negationists and so on, but there is actually a lot of countries who would in principle agree with some common solutions. But so the question I have is that, to what extent in these countries, actually, these powerful companies and pharmaceutics are avoiding, even like from capitalist countries, we are all capitalist countries again, these solutions and the risks that can pose. And I think this is really linked to something you discussed also in the first panel, like this lack of what we would call like a more centrist or what we call a social democratic. There is capitalism, but there is also social elements. There is the people, the citizens, and it's not only about consumers, it's citizenship. And how, can we make those productions of medicines and whatever technology for climate change and so on, make it work for us again? And because the numbers are clear, and again, Stiglitz showed that this morning, the high level of concentration of wealth in 10 billionaire, not even B, but I don't know what the number, and companies as well. How can we revert that production back to the peoples? Because it's unsustainable, we know that. And so it's not to be against capitalism, that how can we make it work for people again? So thank you.
Yes, it goes very well with what you just say. So my name is Bettina de Sousa Guilherme, and I work as an EU fellow in the European University Institute, but I'm actually on a sabbatical from the European Parliament. But I'm not like a trade expert, so more in economic policies, but I was very interested from all your contributions. And of course, in a way, you feel a bit like ashamed when you hear about the vaccinations, because in reality, when I heard Biden say, "Oh, US is in favor of waiving the IPs for the vaccination," I thought, "Fantastic, this is going to happen." And then I hear von der Leyen that the European Union doesn't want it, and I was like really appalled myself. Yeah, maybe. An idea that could be promoted from both our sides. Today, Stephanie Griffiths-Jones was speaking about cooperation of international development banks. And I know that the vaccines were largely, the research on the vaccine was largely co-financed by the European Investment Bank. So maybe it would be a good idea that the European Investment Bank could cooperate with the Brazilian Development Bank and others, and then it could be easier to guarantee this waiving. I think that could be an idea that could be followed. Yeah. Then on a more maybe conflictual point of view to Maureen, and I think probably you agree on some points, but on some points maybe not, yeah, because something that I had also discussed a lot with Andrea, and it goes along with actually democracy. And so I'm come from the European Parliament, and so Mercosur Treaty has been very much criticized for environmental weakness, not enforceability. And this is not just protectionism, yeah. So because also like Giulietta says, it is the Green Deal is a strong priority for the European Union in its internal policies and external policies, because there's no point that we just try to do environmental policies in Europe when, on the other hand, for example, Amazon is burned down or eroded, yeah, and the wood is being imported to the EU, and then we are being blamed again to be hypocrites and so on, yeah. So I mean, there is really a point also of it that the European Parliament has the right to vote on the Mercosur Treaty, and has actually in the first go has voted against, no? As long as there's no enforceable environmental conditions. So this goes actually in that direction where we have to see and discuss, because I also think that Lula was now conditionality. Yeah. And so I was, yeah. So I think that, but what is interesting, and I think also Stiglitz was speaking about it this morning, is that there is a big change, not only this the Green Deal, but also about, because of the pandemic, about questions about industrial policy, no? And I think that Brazil has a strong interest, like, for example, in public procurement. So perhaps it's also a strategy of Brazil, of Mercosur, to open again and say, we need much more freedom in public procurity and in developing industrial policies. They're not just about, it's like a counter proposal for, you know, you quid for quo, no? Maybe it goes in that direction, could possibly be, you know.
I don't know if you want to start.
Yes. Yeah, I can combine a couple of questions. Regarding your question about the private sector participation and combining it with the linkage mentioned, I think it's all these topics. We could have entire conferences, like spend a month talking about each of these topics. So I'm sorry to not mention the linkage, but I think to answer the first question, the way to address it is for governments to charge for what they pay. We invest a lot of money, of public money, of people's money in developing science. And it's not fair that there is no conditionalities. I think we're talking about a lot of conditionalities, and it is possible to do that, but it demands political will, and it also demands, not to be sanctioned when you use your rights. I would cite a very quick example. The only compulsory license Brazil ever did is the Favidens. It was done by Elon Pinheiro, which is an activist that was, talking about access to medicine before a lot of us were even born. She was the director of Fermanguinhos here in Rio, and Brazil was starting its HIV program. Favidens was a very important drug. The price was extremely high, and Brazil was using its legal rights to declare a compulsory license. That again is not without payment to the IP holder. You pay a fee to the IP holder, and Elon Pinheiro did almost an archaeological work to find out how to produce Favidens, because by only the patent, it was not possible to produce it, because all the information, the know-how, the nitty-gritty wasn't there. And Brazil, and Renata Reis was, her PhD is on this whole process. She narrates how Brazilian diplomats were rightfully worried about the sanctions that Brazil was going to suffer, because it was using its rightful, right to declare a compulsory license. So I think it's a big conversation, not only how countries can demand that what they invest is not charged double, but also how other countries, including EU, the US, and other high-income countries, don't threaten countries that prioritize their public health needs. And to connect that with the linkage, another example that how is possible, the NDI works with this model is one of the variations of the linkage. The NDI is a nonprofit. It has an office here in Rio, and it develops treatments for neglected diseases that affect neglected populations. So the NDI has developed some new treatments for Chagas. It's developing treatment for leishmaniasis, and it partners with private sector. It receives grants from the countries, from development banks, and from the private sector too. And in its clauses, it pays back. Sometimes it has a fee for intellectual property, but it states that how the agreement is made with the private sector is that every step of the process is already paid. So the final product doesn't carry the burden to recoup investments. And it's one of the models of the linkage. There are many others, but I think the most important lesson learned is that the linkage is possible, but countries need to have political will and also not be threatened especially international arena, to use it. Just a very quick example that I witnessed of how baffling it is, the pressure against the linkage. In 2016, in the WHO World Health Assembly, they were discussing a big strategy for AMR and how to, stewardship and maintaining the antibiotics that we already have, but also how to incentivize new antibiotics. And the countries that were very close, the delegations that were very close to the private sector, EU and US especially, were voicing the private sector resistance to include any delinkage language in the final agreement. There was a lot of language of countries investing heavy money on developing new antibiotics, on how it would work, like this financial architecture would work to finance development, but they were like, give us the money, and then we talk about price afterwards. Let's not worry about it right now, which is not how you need to do. You need to have access clauses from the beginning, so everyone is on the same page. Everyone knows, you diminish the uncertainty for countries, but also for the private sector, and then they can decide if they want to engage, because you cannot give them all the power to decide on the prices. afterwards. Because when you have a product, a good product developed with public money, then the power is on them. You'll say to your population, oh no, you won't have access to this life-saving medicine because it's kind of scary, it's kind of too expensive. It's very hard to say that. We don't want governments to be saying that. And on the figures, send me an email. I have many figures. I don't have the figures on the tip of my tongue right now, but I have figures for the CFAID machine, for sofosbuvir, for the clatesvir, and for many other medicines and treatments on how small is the in private investment compared to the amount of public investment. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for the questions and comments. They are very hard questions. How to explain the inability of CELAC to speak with one voice? Well, we have to discuss Latin American regional integration history. But to summarize it very quickly, I will focus in two issues, where CELACs appear and what were the goals of CELACs. They remain on the political dialogue basis, looking for some regional integration coordination in the context of crisis and really diversity in Latin America, in a context where trade policies weren't meant to be strategic foreign policies. Trade policies, when CELAC appeared, were limited to technical arena. So trade policies actually were an active part of CELAC. And so we have to trace back, when was the last time that in Latin America trade policies were part of a strategic policy? And I think that leads us to the narrative of the Cepalinos and the 1960s to 1980s period. Recently, there's a researcher from Latin America, but it's based in the state, that published a book on the CEPAL and Latin American role in economic governance that reunions this thinking. And here in Brazil, there are many researchers on Previch and all the legacy. So, but since the 1990s, since the Washington Consensus, trade remained a technical issue with very limited policy space, and there are no narratives in Latin America where someone figure out that maybe if we say together this, we can make something different. So I think academia has a role putting now in the media, in the scenery, in our documents, that trade policy actually can help people to improve its quality of life. But of course, narrative is not enough. You need to have private interests and corporations pushing for this policy, and leadership. And during the last years, leadership was not something available in Latin America. Sadly, it was a consequence of Bolsonaro government and Brazil isolation from the region. So maybe we are in an opportunity of a new time for Latin American trade policies, but this is going to be something of a long term, because in other countries, this is not something being discussed even. And why? Because incentives are abroad. Latin American countries are interested in having FTAs with separate foreign countries. And Mercosur main tension nowadays, if Uruguay wanted to negotiate an FTA with China by itself without its neighbors, without being able of coordinating a trade policy and a trade negotiation strategy. So this is not European Union fault, but it's something that we should be aware. We shouldn't be naive that, CELAC said this, oh, wonderful. No, the European Union knows that the lack of cohesion of Latin American region gives the European Union more power over the region. As European policymakers, it's something that seems okay, but as academics, we should put light on this asymmetrical power and its consequences. How we could, how anyone in government can improve this, I think that promoting regional coordination policies. It's not the same to have a memorandum of understanding bilateral with each country than as an umbrella cooperation agreement that then leaves space for bilateral agreement that you set the agenda for a regional coordination if you want to promote. So I think the European Union is not keen on having a unified Latin America, and EU-LAC is to keep things polite. That business, and at least in trade, happens bilateral, on a bilateral basis, and even as we say, the devil is in the details. So it's not in CELAC, it's not in these big mechanisms. And lastly, if I have time, trade with China and trade with the US is also very asymmetrical, is also very unbalanced. And the interesting question is that intra-Latin American trade has a lot more of value added than extra regional trade. Yeah. And we should focus on what are the needs in order to promote this intra-regional trade that is more value added, it has more employment, it has more quality of life to our citizens. That's really all.
Thank you. I can say just because there's no question directly for me, but just to respond yours, which was more general. No, I guess just to reinforce what I said and my conclusions about the lessons learned, and a lot about what you just responded to him, which is like how your question was more about how the countries can take back their power of providing benefits for the public. So I guess one of, besides also the conditionality point that you brought, especially regarding pharmaceutical industry, which is what I know the best, but also strengthening the normative power of those intergovernmental organizations such as WHO for health. I guess this would be really important to give the strength back to governments and to the public and their population. So I just mentioned that.
There is one specific question, but I also want to dialogue with Christian. Okay. Okay. Now, first of all, I'm not sure if I understand fully what your commentary, but I think we're talking about the side letter that Europe. Okay. I don't know if everybody's following the European Union agreement, but just to put in the same page, there is this agreement in principle that there is 3 documents. We have one for trade and goods, but not only goods, that is included in this chapter of sustainable development. There is other in cooperation that no transparency, anybody knows about what is this document. You ask since from the minister until this was not shared, this was not leaked, so we don't know what is the content. And there is the third one, is the political dialogue that was already leaked, so everybody look in the internet can find and read. This was signed up during the Bolsonaro government into the signing of this principle, no, in 2019. And right now, there is for European Union part in some countries like France, like Belgium, Holland, the Países Baixos. Yeah, they already have criticized about this environmental part of the focus is too much about Amazon. That for us is it's not even only Amazon, because you have the huge impact of Cerrado and other biomes in Brazil. But at the same time, And also because there is some sector to protect in Europe, like France, there is a big population of in rural that's also a producer that's also worry about the impact of the opening this trade for some goods from the Mercosur tariffs. But so this side letter is focused on the environmental. Okay, I come from a national, I'm also professor here, but I come from a national NGO. And since 2020, we create a Brazilian front from social movements, NGOs, academy, specialists, and trade unions that will talk about the impact of this agreement and trying to push the parliament to understand, the population to understand, because until Bolsonaro sign up, anybody's talking anymore. We have a very important historical struggle in Americas against trade agreements, a specific one against the United States. And this was a very strong in Latin America. But after 2 decades, 1 decade, it was lost, this other generation, you know? So we're returning now to come back with this award raising, capacity building. And I think this year I go to the European Parliament 2 times already to talk about this in the audience with the parliamentarians. The first one didn't have the side letter. Right now, the last one was in July. We have already the side letter. And also the debate, it's come from, first of all, the side letter for us didn't solve the main problem of the agreement, because the main problem is the imbalance. No, so it's, you can make some issues, even in the unilateral agreement that the European Unions do, the due diligence, because the due diligence protect more or less some rainforest, but same time, the main one that you have deforestation, that's Cerrado, it's not fully included in that. So for the hand of environmental, don't look like this, it's strong enough to have importance and save the agreement. This is our position. And we understand the worry of the government and the countries about the protectionism. This always be Brazilian issue in the foreign policies. The main issue that Brazil always have worry about, make any declaration about forests, things like that, is always because the push relates to trade. I think for one side is changing this behavior, but at the same time, this side letter, it's really, really sounds very like an imposition for the governments. The feeling of Brazil, the feeling of Uruguay, the feeling of Paraguay, and the feeling of Argentina is that the European Union say, okay, if you do this, we sign up. But that's the agreements of a lot already beneficial for European Union, much more for Mercosur. And they are asking more, give the Mercosur a situation to, okay, if you want this, we can ask more again, because it's a kind of reopen. And if you read the data that Mercosur offer in response, even if you respond only the side letter, they are open up for a lot of areas from the agreement. They don't talk about the public procurement directly, but they talk about the right to do public policies. Mm-hmm. And when they say, I want public policies on health, on education, on, they are talking about public procurement. No, so yeah, so for us, okay, this is good, because now if European Union accept, let's reopen the negotiation, but facing the asymmetries, because like that, it's not even positive for the main one that probably wins something with that, that's the agribusiness in Brazil. The only issue that I want to complete, that the majority of asks, it's related to a kind of model of the agriculture that, as me as an ecologist, completely disagree. I don't think this will face climate change. I don't think this is face our ecological crisis, because this is a model an old model of agriculture. Talking about agriculture 4.0, for me, it's a step back for an old green revolution, because this demands a lot of land, demands a lot of chemical agrotoxins and a lot of products that are not keeping. And when you talk about rastreability and all this blockchain, all this is European technology. So when you including these environmental clauses, that there is also a connect cell, because you are pushing also European patents, European cells to these countries because the European Union in this unilateral measure also only buy this project if you have this certification, if you have this blockchain, and who you offer that, European companies. So this is asymmetrical again. And who be pushing also the green ecology and blah, blah, blah plan and the climate change. As we are offering also the raw materials, and this is related to the deforestation, this is in relation to a lot of bad impacts in the environment, but not only environment, because when we're talking about environment, talk about people. You don't have forests without people in Brazil. No? So it's a social environment. They don't have time to push about that. But when you talk about this, you are saying that all these measures and all these green politics is pushing to a two kind of blames, a two kind of, I don't know if it's not a blame, it's a kind of culpas, or a kind of obligations for the South. The first of all, the dependence of the trade of this country to keep offering natural resources and all these impacts of this agenda and this development. For second hand, during this process, you are already doing the deforestation and our emissions. But who paid these emissions? You'll be included in our NDCs and not in the North NDCs. So you pay these 2 times. And this is not included in this agreement. As also is not included in this agreement any kind of alternatives to face this kind of developed model. And because of this, I finished dialogue with Christian, because when he asked you, and I didn't know that if you answer him, I'm not sure if you answer him, because sometimes my English it's not good enough, about the comparison, I think was yours, no, Juliette, about the comparison of European Union and China to CELAC. What I would like to mention, and I answered that to the Parliament, in European Union Parliament, because lots of delegates, Eurodeputies, it's worry, because they say, you have to finish this agreement, because if Mercosur didn't finish European Union, they will do with the China. Like, it's not like China and Europe. You can do with both, doesn't matter. No, the trade is big. Brazil right now, it's really, the flow with China is bad. 35% is a lot. If Brazil only keep doing with China, you'll be very complicated. The idea is to diversify. So this argument, it's not really, realistically. But I only want to answer Christian, because, and it would be very good if you do this comparison, because you're reading the bilateral agreement between Brazil and China in the last visit of Lula, the only visit of Lula in April, and he asked who is more colonialist. I answered this in the parliament, because I said that, but the first of all, you don't see in this what they tell us about the cooperation agreement that you don't see. Don't even look close to these memorandums that China and Brazil sign. There is, just to tell you, a lot of things about transference of technology. We're not talking about only selling technology. When you talk about a bilateral executive plan 2022 to 2026, about flow of peoples and flow of the academical studies and university, it's other issue, it's a cooperation in other area. When you talk about cooperation in digital economy and investments in sustainable development and the renewal of the aerospace sector agreement, or if they talk about the Brazil-China space cooperation of 2023 to 2032, or the BRICS remote sense satellite constellation, or the complementary CBR-6, is a satellite that Brazil and China has since the 80s, protocol of the joint development, we really talk about transference of technology. And if you read the declaration, you finish and say, wow, this is not only trade. This is not only trade. And this is a push to develop it together. Of course, you know that any country and all the countries have their own interests. But this is at least, you look for the other one and you push to the capacity of the other one to develop. And I don't think right now, when you leak a document like European Union, you saw that criticize a possibility for a country to, after all we pass in Brazil, during 4 years of Bolsonaro, and have the courage to publish, not publish because it was leaked, write down that against the reindustrialization, for me, it's a really big shame. Because, wait, the countries have their, it's a right. It's about rights. It's not about solidarity, you know? So this, for me, it's the main big issue. So yes, who is more colonialist? For me, European Union, related to China. Thank you.
We have to finish.
No, I just want to, for me, I mean, I said already before, I think it's fair enough if like you want to talk about reindustrialization. And in fact, if you look about after the pandemic, even the European Union, and if you look France and so, they say the need of reindustrialization even for European Union countries. Yeah, so I mean, I think that then the EU-Mercosur contract was outdated because it was still in this ideology of before the last 20 years, before the pandemic, before all the changes that happened. But like, I mean, from a European Union point of view, it's a bit bizarre when we have Lula who is promoting climate change, and in the moment we said, let's put some fixed enforceable rules in environment. No interference. Yeah, that's a bit like hypocrisy. Yeah, and okay, I think that maybe the proposal is a proposal on the table, and it can be changed from the Brazilian and from the other side. Yeah, but to say no, we don't want any enforceable right, then how are you ever gonna improve environmental sustainability? So I mean, there's a like also a kind of hypocrisy. You know, I mean, no, and another thing, yeah, because also if there is something environmental rights are assigned, it also protects for future governments that might change again to a Bolsonaro government that might not be like your current government, yeah, that could again damage environment massively, no?
Which we continue tomorrow.
So we wait. We hope everybody can come tomorrow. Thank you. We had a very rich and vibrant discussion. And excuse me if I didn't control time.